What happens when the unstoppable force of a new political firebrand collides with the unshakable legacy of a progressive icon? No one saw it coming. The moment Karoline Leavitt, the 27-year-old lightning rod of the MAGA movement, stepped onto the stage and tore into the glittering myth of the Obama era with the precision of a surgeon and the fury of a storm. The lights of the American Forum blazed like a battlefield under siege, the air thick with anticipation, the hum of a nation, holding its breath. On one side stood Michelle Obama, the embodiment of grace, progress, and a legacy that had shaped a generation. Her very presence a symbol of hope, her words carrying the weight of history. On the other, Karoline Leavitt, young, razor-sharp, and unafraid, a woman who had risen like a wildfire through conservative ranks, her every sentence a calculated strike against the old guard. The audience knew within seconds that this was no polite debate. This was war. Karoline's heart raced, but she kept her cool as she adjusted the microphone. The eyes of millions were on her, and the weight of the moment felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She had spent years preparing for this very moment. Every speech, every debate, every media appearance had been leading up to it. The night was hers to own, and she was determined to make history. As Michelle spoke about unity, compassion, and the importance of lifting marginalized communities, Karoline's mind sharpened. Her turn came, and instead of responding directly, she leaned, in her blue eyes cold and calculated. "Mrs. Obama," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "You talk about hope, but what about the families drowning in debt because of your husband's policies?" The crowd erupted into chaos. MAGA supporters cheered wildly, while those on the left looked on in disbelief. Michelle's face remained composed, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. The rules of this debate had already changed. Karoline had not come to discuss. She had come to dismantle. Every word she spoke felt like a deliberate strike. The statistics she dropped were damning. Stories of lost jobs in Ohio, families crushed. Under the weight of Obamacare's rising costs, businesses crushed by regulations. With each blow, she drove the message home. The Obama legacy had failed many, and it was time for a new vision. Michelle, though dignified, couldn't match Karoline's relentless precision. As the tension in the room reached a fever pitch, Karoline turned to the camera and asked, "Whose America do you want? One of broken promises, or one where hard work means something again?" The room went silent for a moment, and then exploded with applause. The Obama legacy, once untouchable, now had cracks running through it. Karoline had made her point, and it was clear she was here to stay. As Karoline left the stage, the weight of what had just transpired began to settle in. Backstage, her team was a whirlwind of excitement, their phones buzzing with congratulatory messages and media coverage. One call in particular stood out, President Trump himself. His voice boomed through the speaker, exclaiming, "You just made history, Karoline." But even as her supporters celebrated, Karoline felt a strange knot of unease in her stomach. This moment, this victory, was bigger than her, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for the storm that was about to break loose. She had spent years climbing to this point, perfecting her arguments, practicing her delivery. But now that she had succeeded in delivering the knockout punch, the battle was far from over. Karoline knew that her success had just opened the floodgates of both admiration and criticism. The right was cheering, but the left was already plotting their counterattack. The media was already framing her as the new face of the conservative movement, but Karoline knew that the real challenge would come in the aftermath. How would she hold on to this momentum? As Karoline sat in the green room, she replayed the audio debate in her mind. The way Michelle's eyes had briefly flickered with uncertainty when Karoline hit her with the economic data. The way she had tried to maintain composure despite the cracks forming in her facade. Karoline had seen it, and it had fueled her resolve. This wasn't just a political victory, it was a psychological one. She had broken the aura of invincibility surrounding the Obama legacy, and in that moment, she had become more than a rising star. She had become the leader of a new era. But even as the media storm swirled around her, Karoline could sense the subtle shifts happening in the political landscape. Whispers of admiration mixed with veiled warnings. Some saw her as the future, others saw her as a threat. The world was watching, and Karoline had no intention of backing down. As the phone calls and messages kept pouring in, one thing became clear to her. She wasn't just playing the game anymore. She was rewriting the rules. The days after the debate were a whirlwind of media interviews, strategy meetings, and endless phone calls. Karoline had never been more in demand. Conservative pundits hailed her as a savior of the movement, while others, particularly in the progressive circles, warned that she was a threat to everything they stood for. Each headline she saw, every new piece of analysis, only solidified her resolve. She had become the center of a political storm, and she wasn't about to back down. But as the world watched her every move, she felt the weight of her decisions pressing down harder than ever before. The turning point came unexpectedly, during a live interview with a renowned political analyst. Karoline had prepared for the usual questions about her upbringing, her rise in politics, and her views on economic policies. But the interview quickly turned personal when the host asked, "Do you think you've done more harm than good in dismantling the Obama legacy?" The question struck her like a bolt of lightning, the kind of question that could make or break her career. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, the room feeling smaller by the second. Her heart raced, but she didn't flinch. It was a question Karoline had been expecting, but not so soon. And now, it wasn't just about defending herself, it was about defining what she stood for. She leaned forward, meeting the host's gaze, and answered with a confidence that she hadn't fully felt before. "What's more harmful?" she asked, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Allowing an entire generation to fall behind because of policies that didn't work, or finally confronting the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be?" The response was electric. The host fell silent, and the room seemed to hold its breath. For the first time since the debate, Karoline felt a shift within herself. She wasn't just defending her actions anymore. She was embracing them. She was defining herself in real time, and the world was watching. The media instantly exploded with reactions. Some saw her as a hero, others as a villain, but no one could ignore her presence anymore. Later that evening, as Karoline reviewed the footage of the interview, she was struck by her own words. She had always known that the confrontation with the Obama legacy was inevitable. But now she realized that it wasn't just about the past. It was about the future. She had become a symbol for those who felt left behind by the establishment, a voice for the forgotten. But in this moment, she also understood that she had to be more than just an opposition figure. She had to offer something new, something more than criticism. If she was to truly lead, she would need to build a vision that could unite those who were tired of the old political games. But as Karoline reflected on her growing influence, doubts began to creep in. The road ahead was treacherous. She had made powerful enemies, those who had spent years building their legacies, their power, and their narratives. Now she had upended that. It wasn't just the Obama camp she had to worry about. It was every political institution that had been built over decades. Karoline had become a target, and she knew it. In the days that followed, she started receiving more aggressive pushback, anonymous threats, strategic leaks aimed at undermining her credibility, and whispers in the halls of power that suggested she was more of a threat than a solution. The weight of these attacks hit Karoline hard. She had been trained for public scrutiny, but this felt different. The more she fought back, the more the opposition seemed to dig in. The battle wasn't just political anymore, it was personal. Yet, in her moments of quiet reflection, Karoline found something within herself, a clarity. She had always known this day would come, and now that it was here, she wasn't about to back down. It was time to double down on her mission, to tear down the old guard, expose its flaws, and build a new political narrative that truly served the people. But at what cost? That was the question that loomed over her, gnawing at her conscience. Every battle she fought, every statement she made, seemed to pull her further into the heart of a political war. The stakes had never been higher. The backlash was swift and unforgiving. Karoline had known she would stir up opposition, but she hadn't anticipated the full scale of the storm that followed. Progressive commentators attacked her relentlessly, framing her as a divisive force who sought to tear down the pillars of American democracy. On the other side, conservative pundits hailed her as the future of the movement. But the truth was more complicated. As Karoline fought to keep her narrative intact, she began to feel the toll of the constant pressure, both public and private. The most surprising part, however, wasn't the media storm. It was the ripple effect within her own team. People she had once trusted, those who had helped her rise from obscurity to the center of a national conversation, began to falter under the weight of the conflict. Her campaign manager, a seasoned strategist, started showing signs of doubt. He had been with her through thick and thin, but now he was growing increasingly uneasy with the direction Karoline was taking. "We need to rethink this approach," he suggested one evening, his voice unusually strained. "We're winning, yes, but we're creating enemies everywhere. The left isn't going to just let you dismantle their legacy like this, and we can't keep playing this game by their rules." Karoline looked at him, her heart heavy. She had always respected his judgment, but now it felt like he was questioning everything they had built. "What do you suggest?" she asked, her tone quieter than she intended. He paused, a look of hesitation on his face. "Maybe it's time to step back and focus on the long-term vision. You've done the hard work, but we need to build more than just a narrative of opposition. You need to have a plan for what comes next, Karoline. Otherwise, all this momentum will fade. It's time to pivot." The words hit her harder than expected. A pivot? The idea of stepping back, of changing course, felt like a betrayal of everything she had fought for. She had fought so hard to dismantle. The old guard, now she was supposed to offer them a seat at the table. But as she lay awake that night, the weight of her decisions began to settle deeper within her. Was she willing to sacrifice everything she had built just to fight for the past? Or could she truly be the one to lead her party into the future? Over the next few weeks, Karoline found herself stuck between two conflicting forces. On one side, she had the fury of her base, demanding more criticism, more dismantling of the status quo. They wanted her to keep pushing, keep striking, to never show weakness. But on the other side, her campaign staff, her allies, even some members of her family, were urging her to consider a more strategic path. It wasn't enough to just tear things down. She had to rebuild. She had to offer solutions, not just problems. The tension within Karoline grew as she tried to balance the ideals of her movement with the demands of those around her. Her internal struggle was palpable. She could feel the tug-of-war between two versions of herself. One, the fierce challenger, unrelenting in her desire to burn the system to the ground. The other, the more measured leader, who could bring people together and chart a new course. It felt like she was standing at the edge of a precipice, with no clear way forward. As the weeks passed, she found herself revisiting old speeches, interviews, and articles written about her. She was struck by a single line that had once seemed insignificant. A political analyst had once described her as a force of nature, for better or worse. Back then, Karoline had taken it as a compliment. Now, it felt like a warning. Could she really sustain this momentum? Could she continue to be the force that the country needed, or was she doomed to become a political flash in the pan? But there was one thing Karoline couldn't shake. The legacy of the Obama era. The system that had once been so revered had left a deep wound in America. The promises made had been shattered, and for too long, the people who had bought into that vision had been left to pick up the pieces. It wasn't just about politics. It was about the future of the nation. And if she was going to be the one to lead them forward, she had to be bold, even if it meant losing everything she had worked for. Karoline didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. This fight was far from over. The weight of Karoline's decisions became unbearable in the days following her internal battle. The political firestorm she had ignited was no longer just a distant rumble. It was an all-consuming force. Headlines still screamed her name. Her supporters cheered, her critics jeered, but Karoline felt no solace in either group. She spent more time in solitude than ever before, navigating a complex sea of emotions. In the quiet moments when the cameras were off, she couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? Every choice she made felt like a gamble. The pressure was unrelenting, the expectations suffocating. The world wanted her to be more than just a disruptor. They wanted her to be a solution. But how could she provide answers when she was still trying to figure out the question? Her past decisions had been reactions to the political system she despised. Attacks, sharp criticisms, bold statements. But now, Karoline was starting to question if that was enough. Could she build something meaningful, something lasting, or would her legacy be defined by her ability to tear down rather than create? As Karoline reflected on her journey, she began to feel the weight of the ideological divide she had become a part of. She had always believed in the cause, the righteousness of her message, but now she saw the cracks in the armor. The people who had supported her were passionate, but they were also fractured. Some wanted revenge for perceived injustices, others wanted change, but were afraid of the chaos that might come with it. Karoline had unleashed something wild. But now she was realizing that she wasn't just leading a movement. She was navigating an ideological war. The constant attacks from her opponents felt more personal than ever before. She had thought she was invincible, that the momentum of the MAGA movement would carry her forward. But the deeper she delved into the fractured politics of the country, the more she felt the gnawing sense of isolation. It wasn't just that she was fighting the old guard, she was fighting everyone. From the liberals who saw her as a threat, to the establishment Republicans who feared her rise, to the centrists who warned her that her rhetoric was too extreme, everyone seemed to want her to fail. The more she tried to push forward, the more walls seemed to rise around her. But then, during a private conversation with a mentor, Karoline was struck by a revelation. Her mentor, a seasoned political strategist who had helped countless candidates navigate difficult terrain, looked at her and said, "You can't fix everything in one move. You have to build, one piece at a time." The words resonated deeply. Karoline had been so focused on making a big splash, on tearing down the existing system with one massive strike, that she hadn't stopped to think about how to rebuild the trust she had shattered. Her movement was powerful, yes, but it was fractured, and it needed more than just anger to succeed. It needed unity, vision, and a roadmap forward. The realization hit her like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just about burning down the old structures. It was about laying the groundwork for a new future. She needed to shift her strategy. Instead of focusing purely on destruction, Karoline knew she had to start offering solutions that resonated with the people who had supported her and those who had been alienated by her message. But even as this clarity began to emerge, Karoline found herself battling a new kind of fear. The fear that if she changed course now, she might lose everything she had worked for. The media would paint it as weakness. Her opponents would use it against her. The very people who had rallied behind her would begin to question her resolve. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't ignore the truth. She couldn't keep fighting the same battles, using the same tactics, if she wanted to make a real difference. As the days went by, the weight of her decisions became heavier. Karoline knew she couldn't go back to the way things were before, but she wasn't sure how to move forward. Could she redefine herself in the eyes of the public, or had she already gone too far to return? The pressure of expectation, of constantly having to be on, was wearing her down. But in the midst of it all, Karoline held on to one truth. She had sparked something powerful, something that couldn't be undone. Now, it was time to decide what that power would ultimately stand for. The pressure had reached its peak. Karoline had spent weeks reevaluating her every move, her every word. She had been thrust into the limelight and forced to carry the weight of a fractured political landscape. Yet, in the quietest moments of reflection, she realized that the more she tried to please everyone, the more she risked losing herself. The shift in her strategy, her new approach, felt like both a rebirth and a risk. The ground beneath her feet was shaky, but she was learning how to walk on it. The change in direction was evident to everyone around her. Her speeches, once filled with blistering critiques of the old guard, now spoke of rebuilding. She started to address the issues she had once dismissed as liberal talking points: healthcare, education, and the environment, though with a conservative lens. Karoline was beginning to offer solutions, not just criticisms. She talked about reforming healthcare to make it affordable and accessible, but without the bloated bureaucracy she had criticized under Obamacare. She discussed a plan to tackle climate change through innovative technologies rather than government mandates. Karoline wasn't just aiming to deconstruct the system anymore. She was charting a path forward, a path that balanced idealism with pragmatism. Her new approach wasn't without its challenges. Her base, which had initially been energized by her sharp rhetoric and unwavering stance, began to waver. Some of them felt betrayed, like she was softening, compromising. The political right had always been a hardball game, and Karoline's pivot felt like she was playing by the wrong set of rules. There were whispers, some louder than others, that she was losing her edge. She wasn't the fierce, unstoppable force they had once loved. She was becoming a politician. And in their eyes, that was the worst thing she could become. Despite the growing unrest among her followers, there were signs of hope in other quarters. Some centrist Democrats began to see Karoline as a potential bridge, someone who could move the country away from the partisan gridlock that had consumed Washington for years. Her ability to focus on solutions, even those that didn't fit neatly, into one political box, earned her a new kind of respect. Slowly, she started to gain traction among voters who had never considered supporting her before. The political landscape was changing, and Karoline Leavitt was becoming a symbol of that change, a young, fierce leader who could unite both sides of the aisle, even if it meant sacrificing some of the purity of her earlier ideology. But as the tide shifted, Karoline's internal conflict only deepened. The more she navigated this new political terrain, the more she realized how isolated she felt. Her old allies had become strangers, and her new allies were unsure of her sincerity. There were days when Karoline doubted her own decisions. Was she truly doing the right thing by shifting her stance, or was she simply trying to survive in a system that didn't have room for revolutionaries? The weight of the world seemed to press down on her shoulders, and for the first time since stepping into the political arena, Karoline questioned whether the fight she had started was worth the toll it had taken on her. Her nights were filled with restless sleep, plagued by visions of what might come next. Was this the end of her story? Or was it the beginning of something even bigger? Karoline didn't know, but she did know this. She couldn't stand still. The political battlefield had already been reshaped. If she wanted to be a part of the future, she needed to move forward, no matter how uncertain that future was. Then one afternoon, Karoline had an unexpected meeting with an old friend, a former ally who had been part of her early rise in politics. They met in a small cafe, far from the prying eyes of the media. The conversation began innocuously enough, but as it unfolded, it became clear that Karoline's path was not just a personal journey. It was a test of the very political system she had been trying to destroy. "You've come a long way, Karoline," her friend said, watching her with an unreadable expression. "But here's the thing. There's always going to be a price for trying to change the system. The people you're trying to help, they don't care about your personal evolution. They want results. They want someone who will stand by their principles, no matter what." Her friend's words struck her deeply. Karoline had spent so much time thinking about strategy, about compromise, that she had forgotten about the core reason she had entered politics in the first place. To fight for those who had been forgotten, to stand as a voice for the voiceless. The moment felt like a reset. Karoline walked out of that cafe with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew that no matter what path she took, she couldn't lose sight of her original mission. She couldn't afford to get lost in the noise. If she was going to keep fighting, it had to be for something more than personal gain, more than political maneuvering. She needed to be true to the very people who had made her who she was. The forgotten, the working class, those who had been left behind by the system. Karoline stood at the center of the political stage, her eyes focused ahead, scanning the sea of faces before her. The room was thick with anticipation, the air heavy with the weight of history. Everything she had fought for, every decision she had made, had led to this moment. This wasn't just another speech. It was her reckoning. The stakes had never been higher. The audience, across the country and around the world, was waiting to see who Karoline Leavitt would become. Would she be the fierce firebrand who tore down the old order, or would she become just another politician, blending into the system she once sought to destroy? The journey had been long and tumultuous. Karoline had faced attacks from all sides, some aimed at her policies, others at her character. The pressure had broken her, reshaped her, and yet here she was, standing stronger than ever before. The room fell silent as she stepped up to the podium. With a deep breath, she began. "Today we stand at a crossroads," she started, her voice unwavering. "A crossroads between the old way and the new way. A crossroads between the past and the future. The question is no longer whether we can change this country, it's whether we have the courage to change it together." For the first time, Karoline felt at peace. She had found her voice again. She wasn't speaking just to the MAGA base, or to the centrist Democrats who had started to take notice of her. She was speaking to everyone, those who felt disillusioned, those who felt left behind, those who had given up hope. She understood them now in a way she never had before. The ideological war was still there, but the fight had evolved. This wasn't just about policy anymore. It was about people, about their lives, their struggles, and their dreams. Karoline spoke of unity, real unity, not the kind that was offered as a political talking point, but the kind that came from understanding. She spoke of a nation divided not by political parties, but by its refusal to listen to one another. She told the story of the factory workers in Ohio, the small business owners in Texas, the students burdened by debt, and the families torn apart by rising healthcare costs. These were the people who had been forgotten by the political elite, the people who had been pushed aside in the rush to pass legislation and gain power. "We can't keep blaming each other," Karoline said. "It's not about red states or blue states. It's about one nation, one people, one future. And if we can't see each other as more than labels, more than opponents, then we will never move forward." The room was still, the only sound the soft hum of cameras recording her every word. For a moment it felt as if time had stopped. Karoline's speech was no longer just words. It was a call to action, a call for every American to rise above the rhetoric, to see the common humanity in each other, to build a future together that was stronger than their divisions. But as the words left her lips, the realization struck her hard. This was her final stand. This was the culmination of everything she had tried to achieve. Her vision for the country, her fight against a broken system. Whether she succeeded or failed, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had stayed true to herself. She had fought, and in doing so, she had changed the game. The applause that followed was not just from her supporters. There were people in the crowd, on both sides of the aisle, who stood and clapped, not because they agreed with everything she said, but because they recognized the authenticity in her words. The shift had begun. Karoline had redefined what it meant to be a politician, to be a leader, to be a voice for the people. She had shown that it was possible to fight for change without sacrificing integrity. As she left the stage, her heart raced with a mixture of pride and exhaustion. The world was watching, and the future was uncertain. But in that moment, Karoline knew that she had done everything she could. She had given everything to the cause, and now it was in the hands of the people. She couldn't control the outcome, but she had made her mark. The political landscape had irrevocably shifted. Karoline Leavitt wasn't just a firebrand. She was a force for change, a symbol of a new kind of leadership, one that transcended party lines, one that spoke to the heart of what it meant to be American. And as she walked off the stage, the question lingered in the air, both for her and for the nation. Was this truly the beginning of a new era? Or was it the last spark of hope before the fire went out? What do you think? This could be the conclusion to Karoline's journey, but there's always room for a new chapter if you'd like.